The sun bakes the flat earth until it cracks. The air hums with heat and silence, a silence broken only by the slow, dry groan of a dying irrigation pump. Beside it, an American farmer kneels in the dust, his shirt soaked in sweat, his hands trembling with exhaustion. The war has taken his sons, his workers, his strength, but not the stubborn will that keeps him on this land. Behind the wire fence a few yards away, German prisoners watch. Men who once fought in North Africa, Italy, and France now stand in faded khaki, their faces burned by the same sun. Among them, one man steps forward, lean, quiet, his eyes fixed on the broken machine. A guard hesitates, but the prisoner gestures toward the pump, wordlessly asking permission. Then, from his pocket, he pulls a scrap of wire, a fragment of metal, something useless to most eyes. Moments later, water begins to flow again. The farmer stares in disbelief. A trick of wire, simple, stupid, yet miraculous, has just saved his dying fields. And it was done by a German prisoner of war. By 1943, the Second World War had stretched its claws across every ocean, every continent. The Allies were advancing, slowly, painfully, through the deserts of North Africa and the ruined villages of Italy. And with every victory came prisoners. Hundreds of thousands of German and Italian soldiers were captured, too many to be kept near the front. The United States, with its vast space and secure distance from the front lines, became the logical destination. Between 1943 and 1946, nearly 425,000 Axis prisoners of war were shipped across the Atlantic. They were spread across more than 500 camps in the American heartland, from Oregon's pine forests to the hot, open plains of Texas. Texas, in particular, became a center of this quiet chapter of wartime history. By 1944, more than 78,000 German POWs lived and worked across the state, an army of captured men hidden in plain sight. They were housed in large base camps, such as Camp Hearn, Camp Swift, and Camp Huntsville, as well as smaller branch camps scattered near cotton fields, canneries, and lumber mills. For many Texans, these prisoners were the first Germans they had ever seen. To them, the men behind the barbed wire represented the same enemy their sons were fighting across the ocean. But America's war machine had an unexpected problem, a problem that would soon turn those enemies into a lifeline. The American war effort demanded every able-bodied man. Millions had enlisted or been drafted. Across rural America, farms stood half empty, their machinery rusting, their crops withering for lack of hands. Food, the most basic weapon of war, was in danger of running short. Washington needed a solution. And so, under the Geneva Convention of 1929, the United States authorized the use of POW labor. Captured enemy soldiers could be employed for non-military purposes, agricultural work, construction, lumber, maintenance, as long as they were treated humanely and paid a modest wage. What began as a logistical experiment soon became essential. By mid-1944, POW labor accounted for nearly a third of the agricultural workforce in parts of the South and Midwest. German soldiers who had once manned tanks and artillery now picked cotton, harvested wheat, repaired fences, and loaded trucks, all under the watch of American guards. The irony was striking. While U.S. troops fought and died in Europe, the bread they ate, the grain that filled their rations, and the cotton that wrapped their bandages were often harvested by captured Germans working Texas soil. For the prisoners, this new existence was surreal. They had gone from the front lines of Hitler's war to quiet days under the Texas sun. Many were astonished by their treatment: decent food, open skies, even newspapers and music. The camps followed strict order, but they were humane. American officers, determined to follow international law to the letter, ensured discipline without cruelty. Some prisoners were defiant, clinging to Nazi ideals. Others were simply grateful to be alive. And among them were men who had been engineers, machinists, mechanics, trained minds whose skills now lay dormant behind wire fences. The farmers who hired them were at first cautious, even hostile. "Don't trust the Krauts," many said. "They'll sabotage your land." But desperation softened suspicion. The drought of 1944 hit Texas hard. Crops burned in the fields, water pumps broke down. With American labor gone, the farms could not survive without help. That was when German hands began to rebuild America's rural lifeline, quietly, efficiently, often without recognition. In dusty counties like Brazos, Burleson, and Gillespie, farmers began to notice something unexpected. The Germans weren't just strong laborers. Many were skilled. Some had studied engineering before the war. Some were trained technicians or factory workers. They fixed tractors, windmills, and generators that local repairmen had given up on. One of these men, whose name history barely recorded, would soon find himself working on a small Texas farm, face to face with an exhausted American farmer and a broken irrigation pump that stood between survival and ruin. And that farm, surrounded by endless miles of cracked soil and scorched corn stalks, would become the unlikely setting for one of the quietest, most human stories of the entire war. The story of a stupid wire trick that saved a Texas farm. The German POW camps scattered across Texas were paradoxical places. Behind the barbed wire, the men were technically prisoners, yet their daily lives bore little resemblance to the grim camps they'd imagined in Nazi propaganda. There were no torture chambers, no starvation. Instead, there were barracks lined with cots, mess halls that served regular meals, and strict schedules designed to maintain order. The United States Army enforced the Geneva Convention meticulously, partly out of principle, partly out of strategy. The idea was simple: treat German prisoners well, and American soldiers captured overseas might receive the same treatment in return. Every morning, bugles marked the start of the day. Prisoners lined up for roll call, breakfast, and work assignments. In Texas, those assignments often meant long hours in the fields. Under guard, the Germans were trucked to nearby farms, lumber yards, or canneries. They were paid 80 cents a day in canteen coupons, enough to buy cigarettes, soap, or stationery. It was honest, monotonous labor, but to many, it was a relief from the front lines. Some of the POWs began to form uneasy bonds with local Americans. Children would wave as trucks passed. Farmers' wives left cold water near the fields. In small acts of civility, barriers began to fade, but not everyone was comfortable. Newspapers carried uneasy headlines: enemy soldiers on Texas soil. Rumors spread that Nazis were escaping or spreading propaganda. In reality, escapes were rare. Where could a man in a foreign land, surrounded by miles of open prairie, possibly go? Most stayed put, following orders, waiting for the war to end. Inside the wire, the prisoners built small pieces of Germany. They played soccer, sang folk songs, and even held classes. Educated men taught English or mathematics to others. Some drew, some carved wood, and others tinkered with whatever scraps of machinery they could find. For many, especially the engineers and technicians, idle hands were a curse. They longed for something to repair, something to prove they were still useful men. It was at one of the smaller branch camps near Brazos County where our story takes root. The camp held fewer than 200 prisoners, all Germans captured in North Africa, veterans of Rommel's Africa Corps. These men, used to the mechanics of desert warfare, were familiar with engines, pumps, and the practical challenges of survival under harsh conditions. Every morning, small work crews were escorted to nearby farms where they picked cotton, dug trenches, or mended fences. The war had stripped rural Texas of its young men. Only the elderly and the very young remained. The women ran households, while the fields cried for labor. One of those farms belonged to a man named Robert Bob Whitaker, a third-generation cotton and corn farmer in his late 40s. He had lost both of his sons to the Army draft and ran the farm alone, his back aching, his equipment aging, his crops struggling. The drought of 1944 was merciless. His irrigation pump, the heart of his farm, sputtered and died more than once. Each breakdown meant lost days, and each lost day meant less harvest, less money, less food, less hope. When the Army offered POW labor, Whitaker agreed reluctantly. To him, it felt wrong, employing Germans while his own boys were fighting them overseas. But survival leaves little room for pride. By mid-July 1944, a work crew of 6 German POWs arrived at the Whitaker farm. They came in a military truck under guard, tanned, silent men in khaki. Among them was a man in his 30s named Karl Weber, once a mechanical engineer from Stuttgart. To Whitaker, Weber looked like any other prisoner: sharp eyes, wiry frame, quiet posture, but behind those eyes lay a lifetime of skill with machines. He had repaired trucks in Africa, built field pumps in Libya, and understood metal the way a carpenter understands wood. Each day the men worked from sunrise to sunset, stooping in the fields, stacking sacks, and helping repair fences. Whitaker rarely spoke to them, save for gestures or curt instructions. The guard, a young Texan soldier barely 20, ensured order with quiet professionalism. Then came the day the irrigation system broke again, a faint metallic clatter, a hiss of escaping water, and the steady hum of the pump ground to silence. The motor had overheated. A connecting wire had burned through, small but catastrophic. Whitaker cursed under his breath, knowing the nearest parts depot was 2 counties away, and every hour meant another layer of dust settling over his thirsty crops. The guard watched from the shade. The prisoners stood still, waiting. Weber, wiping his hands, stepped forward slightly, eyeing the machinery. He recognized the problem instantly, and its solution. But he was the enemy, and this was not his land. That hesitation, between orders, between fear and instinct, would soon set the stage for a moment that neither man would ever forget. A moment when a single scrap of wire would bridge not only a broken circuit, but 2 warring worlds. For Robert Whitaker, every inch of that land was inheritance, soil worked by his father and grandfather, tilled by mule and machine alike. But now it was drying, dying. His sons were gone, wearing U.S. uniforms somewhere in France or Italy, and his help was gone with them. When the pump died that July afternoon, Whitaker saw not just a machine failing, but his entire livelihood collapsing with it. He kicked the metal housing in frustration, the echo rattling across the empty field. Sweat and dust stung his eyes. The crops wilted before his gaze, silent, helpless. He had survived the Great Depression, but this felt worse. The helplessness of watching life drain from the earth while men half a world away fought and bled. Behind the fence, 6 Germans stood motionless. Prisoners, enemies. Whitaker didn't even look at them at first. In his mind, they were just another wartime necessity, laborers lent to him by a government too far away to care whether this patch of Texas lived or died. But one of those men was watching closely. Karl Weber had once designed machinery that ran smoother than any tractor. Before the war, he had worked for a manufacturing firm in Stuttgart, crafting precision instruments. In North Africa, he'd been an engineer under Rommel, fixing tanks in the sand. When captured, he'd been stripped of his rank, his tools, and his purpose. Yet, when the pump failed, instinct replaced hesitation. He knew the sound, the faint choking sputter of a burnt connection. He had seen it before, countless times, under very different suns. He raised his hand slightly, not in defiance, but in quiet request. The young guard, curious, gave a nod. Weber stepped forward. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. A Texas farmer and a German prisoner staring at the same silent machine, separated by language, wire, and war. The irrigation pump was a Fairbanks Morse Type Z engine, a reliable but aging piece of machinery. It was powered by a small electrical motor connected to a crankshaft and water pipe system that fed the fields. The wiring insulation had degraded under the sun, and when one of the copper wires overheated, it broke the electrical circuit completely. To the untrained eye, the damage looked fatal. Replacement wires were scarce, rationed for the war. Even a temporary fix required insulated connectors, the kind no one within 50 miles had on hand. But Weber saw it differently. Years of improvising in desert outposts had taught him a simple truth. Machines obeyed logic, not politics. He inspected the break, his fingers tracing the charred copper. He motioned for a small piece of scrap metal, something thin and flexible. The guard fetched a fragment of fence wire, about 6 inches long. Weber bent it, stripped a section of insulation with a pocket blade, and twisted the metal into a tight makeshift connector. It was, by all standards, a stupid fix. Crude, temporary, unsafe by peacetime standards. But in war, perfection was a luxury no one could afford. He tightened the wire, adjusted the connection, and gestured for the farmer to start the motor. Whitaker hesitated, watching this enemy crouched by his machine. The sight was strange, even unsettling, but he turned the crank anyway. At first, there was nothing, just a low, coughing hum. Then, slowly, a steady rhythm built up. The engine's heartbeat returned. Water gushed through the pipe, splattering into the dusty irrigation ditch. The air filled with the scent of wet earth, that rarest perfume of Texas summer. The prisoners stood silently, watching the flow. The guard grinned. Whitaker exhaled, his chest sinking with relief he didn't want to show. The German straightened, wiping his hands on his trousers, and said nothing. No salute, no smile. Just a faint nod toward the pump, the universal gesture of a man satisfied with his work. The farmer looked at the patch of wire glinting in the sunlight. "Stupid fix," he muttered, half to himself. But there was no anger in his voice. It was the kind of phrase men use when words fall short of gratitude. He turned toward the guard. "What's his name?" "Weber," the guard said quietly. Whitaker didn't thank him, not yet. The war still lived too close to the heart. But that night, when he walked the fields and heard the soft gurgle of water running through the irrigation channels, he found himself thinking of that German, not as an enemy, but as a man who understood machines, and perhaps something more. The next morning, the pump ran perfectly. The crop stood a little taller, and in a simple Texas ledger, Whitaker noted something unusual beside the day's date. Pump fixed, prisoner used wire, works. It was a brief entry, almost absurd in its simplicity. But in that line, history recorded one of thousands of invisible acts that quietly bridged the chasm between enemies. Because across Texas, across America, stories like this repeated themselves. German hands fixing broken American engines, Italian mechanics tuning tractors, Japanese gardeners tending the land, and each time, the same realization echoed beneath the noise of war. Skill had no flag, and dignity could survive even behind barbed wire. The wire trick might have seemed trivial, but it carried something larger, a whisper of understanding, a flicker of mutual respect in a world that had forgotten such things. That single act, born of necessity, powered by knowledge, would ripple far beyond one farm, one drought, one war. In war, hatred becomes easy. It is cultivated, trained, and worn like a uniform. But behind that fence in Texas, the uniforms were faded, the guns silent, and the lines that once divided men began to blur. For Robert Whitaker, the German prisoner's simple act of fixing his pump refused to leave his thoughts. That evening, long after the guards had driven the POWs back to camp, Whitaker sat on his porch staring across the horizon. The cicadas buzzed. The pump hummed steadily in the distance. It was working, and not because of an American mechanic, but because of a man whose country had bombed London and marched across Europe. He thought of his sons. Would they understand this? For months, the war had felt far away, something that existed only in newspapers, in casualty lists, in headlines printed in black ink. But now, the enemy had a face. Not the face of a soldier charging through smoke, but of a quiet man kneeling in the dust, repairing a stranger's machine. The realization was uncomfortable, almost disorienting. War demands distance. Empathy threatens it. And yet, for the first time, Whitaker found the distance collapsing. Inside the camp, Carl Weber experienced his own quiet turmoil. That night, as he lay on his cot in the dim light of the barracks, he could still feel the warmth of the Texas sun on his arms. He had fixed countless machines in his life, but none had left such an ache in his chest. Perhaps it was the farmer's silence, not hostile but heavy, filled with unspoken conflict. Or perhaps it was the simple fact that, for the first time since capture, Weber had done something that mattered. In the camp, most days were meaningless repetitions. Line up, work, eat, sleep. But on that farm, for one brief afternoon, his skill had value again. He had not just obeyed orders. He had solved a problem, given something back to the world, even if that world wore the enemy's colors. He thought of his wife back home, his factory buried under the rubble of Stuttgart, and the twisted irony that it was here, in Texas, as a prisoner, that he had been treated with more dignity than in the final days under the Reich's banners. Weber closed his eyes, the rhythmic buzz of the barracks mingling with the phantom hum of the pump. Somewhere between pride and sorrow, he felt something rare, peace. In every war, there are moments that quietly challenge its purpose. This one began with a broken wire. When word spread among local farmers about the German who fixed the Whitaker pump, reactions were mixed. Some laughed. Figures. They break Europe, then fix our farms. Others frowned, uneasy with the idea of owing gratitude to an enemy. But a few, particularly those who had seen the cost of war up close, understood the deeper truth. Humanity, once shown, could not be untaught. For Whitaker, that understanding came slowly. Over the following weeks, the same POW work crew returned. The guard trusted them more. Whitaker spoke a little more each day. He began leaving small gestures, a canteen of cold water near the pump, an extra sandwich at lunch. Weber would nod silently in thanks. It was not friendship. It was something quieter, recognition. Both men lived within the boundaries drawn by others, one by barbed wire, the other by pride and loss. Yet the wire that once separated them now symbolized something different, a connection built through necessity, forged in respect. American officers overseeing the POW program often remarked that the German prisoners worked with a discipline we could not have paid for. They followed orders, took pride in efficiency, and treated even their temporary labor with precision. For men like Weber, work was not submission, it was survival. Many farmers, including Whitaker, began to see them not as faceless enemies, but as men much like themselves, fathers, craftsmen, survivors of a machine larger than any one person. Years later, a former camp guard from Camp Hearn recalled, "They weren't demons. They were men doing their best to live with the shame of defeat, same as we lived with the fear of losing." The war might have divided them, but necessity had revealed the truth beneath. Decency was not a national trait, it was a human one. The moral paradox of POW labor during World War II was profound. America had captured its enemy, then asked him to help feed the nation. In return, it offered him dignity, food, shelter, and the opportunity to work, even if under guard. For many Germans, that experience shattered years of propaganda. They had been told Americans were barbarians, soulless industrialists. Yet here they were, fed, paid, and treated with respect, even as the war still raged. And for Americans like Whitaker, the lesson was equally humbling. The man he'd been taught to fear and hate had saved his livelihood not with violence, but with intelligence and generosity of spirit. It was a moral inversion, quiet, local, invisible to the grand narratives of victory and defeat. But it mattered, because in moments like these, both sides glimpsed a world beyond orders and uniforms. A world built on the simple act of fixing something broken together. By the time autumn arrived, the drought eased, the fields greened again. The POW crew was reassigned to another county. When the truck carried them away, Whitaker watched from the gate, arms folded, saying nothing. But after they disappeared down the dirt road, he noticed a thin strand of wire lying in the dust, a remnant of that day's repair. He picked it up, coiled it gently, and slipped it into his pocket. He never threw it away. That stupid piece of wire, once the symbol of failure, had become a bridge between two men who should have been enemies. And in that bridge lay the quiet turning point of this story. The morning began like every other that summer, with the sky the color of brass and the ground baked to the hardness of stone, not a cloud for weeks. The smell of dust hung heavy in the air. By noon, the thermometer nailed to the barn door climbed past 100 degrees. Robert Whitaker worked in silence. He no longer cursed the sun. There was no point. Every step he took stirred up powder instead of soil. The cotton leaves hung limp. Thirsty, brittle, the irrigation pump, his last lifeline, chugged along weakly in the distance. Then came the noise. A sharp metallic crack, followed by silence. Whitaker froze. He knew that sound. He had heard it twice before that month. He dropped his shovel and ran toward the motor shed, boots crunching on dry ground. The pump housing was trembling, smoke curling from one corner. The smell of burned copper filled the air. He cut the switch, grabbed his wrench, and knelt beside the machine. His hands shook with frustration as he pried open the panel. Inside, the wiring was charred. A small, innocent wire split clean through. The kind of part that could be replaced in minutes if only he had one. But wartime rationing had made everything scarce, especially copper wire. The nearest replacement stock was in Waco, a day's drive each way. By the time he returned, his fields would be gone. He sat back in the dirt, staring at the lifeless motor, his breath shallow and hot. Behind him, The POW work crew stood by their tools, watching silently through the shimmer of heat. The guard, Private Tom Hensley, shifted uneasily. He was young, 19, with a sunburned neck and a rifle he barely needed. He looked from Whitaker to the Germans, uncertain whether to call it a day. Then one of the prisoners stepped forward, Karl Weber. He approached slowly, hands open, eyes on the machine. His English was limited, but his intent was clear. He pointed at the pump, then made a twisting motion with his fingers. The universal gesture for, "Let me try." Whitaker's first reaction was reflexive. No. He didn't trust them. Couldn't. These were men who had worn the enemy's insignia, who might have cheered when Allied ships sank in the Atlantic. He waved Weber off and turned back to the motor, muttering under his breath. Weber didn't move. He crouched beside the shed door, studying the pump from a distance, his gaze precise, calculating. The guard looked between them, then said quietly, "Sir, maybe let him take a look. Can't hurt none." Whitaker hesitated. Pride and desperation wrestled in his chest. The sun glared down, merciless and steady. He wiped the sweat from his eyes. Finally, he nodded once, sharp, reluctant. Weber stepped closer. Inside the motor housing, he worked methodically, almost reverently. His fingers traced the severed wire, the blackened edges. He could see what had happened: heat fatigue, poor insulation, and a broken circuit. He gestured for something thin and metallic. The guard, understanding, fetched a short length of fence wire from the tool rack. Weber examined it, then stripped the insulation from the ends of the copper line with his pocket knife. Whitaker watched, arms crossed, every muscle taut. He didn't understand what the prisoner was doing, but something in Weber's calmness unsettled him, not in fear, but in recognition. This man had done this before, many times. Weber twisted the wire into place, bridging the break. It was a crude fix. Stupid, Whitaker thought, shaking his head, but it was also elegant in its simplicity. He used the broken insulation itself to shield the joint, then tightened the connection with a scrap of cloth torn from his sleeve. When he stood up, his face was streaked with sweat and dust. He motioned for Whitaker to try the switch. The farmer hesitated, then flipped it. For a second, nothing. Then the motor coughed, once, twice, and roared to life. A low hum built into a steady rhythm. The pipe shuddered, then spat out a dark gush of water. It splashed into the ditch, snaking through the furrows toward the dying crops. The sound, that sound, filled the air like music. The prisoners smiled quietly. The guard laughed under his breath. Whitaker stood motionless, hands resting on his hips. Relief flooded his face, but so did something else: confusion. How could this man, this German, fix in 5 minutes what had nearly destroyed his farm? He knelt to look closer. The repair was holding. Crude, but perfect. The wire gleamed faintly in the sunlight. He looked up. "You did that?" Weber didn't seem to understand. He only nodded once, wiping his hands. His expression was neutral, almost humble. "Stupid trick," Whitaker muttered. "Damn thing actually works." Weber gave a faint smile, the kind that acknowledges effort, not pride. Then he stepped back behind the guard, ready to return to the fence. But Whitaker stopped him. He didn't know why. Maybe it was the look in the man's eyes. Not defiant, not smug, just human. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a half-smoked cigar, and held it out. Weber hesitated, then took it with a small nod of thanks. No words, just understanding. For the first time that summer, the two men stood not as farmer and prisoner, but as equals. Two survivors of different wars, bound by a single piece of wire and a moment of shared silence under the same unrelenting sun. The pump kept running through the night. The water soaked into the fields, the cotton began to breathe again, and by dawn, the land smelled of wet soil and life. In that quiet dawn light, the line between enemy and ally blurred, not through surrender, but through the simple dignity of work. That was the day the war, for a few brief hours, stopped at a Texas farm, and in its place 2 men remembered what peace felt like. The pump's rhythmic hum carried through the night like a heartbeat. For the first time in weeks, the Whitaker farm was alive again. The irrigation ditches filled, the air cool with moisture, and the crops sighing softly in relief. Robert Whitaker sat on the porch steps long after the sun fell, watching the horizon glow faintly from the distant oil fields. His hands were still blackened with grease, and the smell of burnt wire lingered in his shirt. Inside his chest was something new, something uneasy, gratitude. He had been raised on principles of self-reliance. A man fixed his own tools, tended his own land, and asked help from no one. But that afternoon, the hands that had saved his farm weren't his own. They belonged to a German soldier, a man who, not long ago, would have been his sworn enemy. He tried to tell himself it was just a coincidence, a stroke of luck. But deep down, he knew it wasn't. The fix had required skill, instinct, and experience, and he couldn't deny the simple truth. Without that enemy, his land would be dead. In the POW camp that night, Carl Weber sat by the dim light of a kerosene lamp, writing in a small, worn notebook. It was one of the few possessions the Americans allowed him to keep. He wrote in neat, mechanical script, not about politics or war, but about the pump, the repair, the sound of water rushing back through the pipes. His entry was brief, almost clinical. Texas, 19th of July, 1944. Repaired American irrigation system. Simple connection, poor insulation, success. Farmer silent but grateful. But beneath the surface of those words lay something more profound. For the first time since his capture, Weber felt useful again. Not as a cog in a war machine, but as a man capable of creating rather than destroying. He had fought for a cause he no longer believed in. He had seen friends die in the desert, buried beneath sandstorms and ideals. But here, in enemy country, he had fixed something that gave life instead of taking it. That night, as the other prisoners talked softly around him, Weber closed his notebook and looked up at the stars beyond the wire. They were the same stars he had seen from home, the same sky over a world that seemed, for the first time in years, both infinite and small. The next morning, the work crew returned to the Whitaker farm. Whitaker greeted them at the gate, not with words, but with a quiet gesture. He handed each man a tin cup of water, filled cold from the well. The guard raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. When Weber approached, Whitaker hesitated for a moment, then extended his hand, rough, calloused, deliberate. It was not a handshake of friendship, nor of forgiveness. It was something more elemental, acknowledgement. For a second, Weber stared at the hand, unsure. Then he grasped it firmly. No words were exchanged, none were needed. From that day forward, when the POW crew worked the Whitaker fields, the farmer began to trust them with more: tools, engines, fences. The guard watched less closely. The rhythm between the men settled into something quiet and efficient, almost natural. In the nearby town, word of the German engineer spread. At first it was gossip, a curiosity told over lunch counters and barbershops. "You hear about the kraut who fixed Whitaker's pump?" someone would say. "Guess the devil's teaching Yankees how to farm now." But beneath the humor was something softer: respect. The story traveled from farm to farm, reshaped in each retelling. Some dismissed it, others doubted it, but for a few it stirred reflection. If a man like that could save another's land, what did that say about the nature of the enemy they fought? Even Private Hensley, the young guard, carried the story home during his next leave. He told his mother how the German didn't look like a soldier at all, more like a man fixing his own machine. His father, a veteran of the last war, only nodded and said, "War don't change what a man's good at, son, just where he does it." For Whitaker, something in him shifted quietly after that. He still cursed the drought, the army, the endless war taxes. But when he spoke of the prisoners, his tone was different. "They're workers," he'd say, "just like us, some even better." He began leaving tools out, trusting they'd be returned. He even sent a small crate of fresh vegetables, rare in wartime, to the camp kitchen with a note written in blocky, awkward script, for the men who fixed the pump. He never signed it. But in the camp mess hall that evening, when the prisoners received the delivery, Weber understood immediately. Weeks later, as the summer waned, the crew was reassigned to another farm. When the army truck arrived, Whitaker stood by the gate once again. Weber climbed aboard, turning once to look back at the land he had helped revive. The pump still hummed steadily in the distance, the ditches glistening with water under the morning sun. Their eyes met across the short stretch of dust and wire. Whitaker gave a single nod. one man acknowledging another's worth. Weber returned it with the faintest smile before the truck rolled away, leaving behind only the shimmer of heat and the faint echo of its engine. That day, Whitaker walked back to the pump house. The repair was still there, the same twisted wire holding firm, blackened slightly, but strong. He touched it lightly with his finger, almost as if afraid to disturb it. It was a crude fix, yes, a stupid one, by all logic, but it had held, and it had done more than save a machine. It had repaired something invisible, the farmer's faith in people, perhaps even in himself. Because somewhere between pride and prejudice, a wire had bridged two men across a chasm carved by war. That quiet victory, unseen by generals, unmentioned in newspapers, was a moment of peace in a world consumed by conflict, a single connection of metal and trust that, for one Texas farm, had changed everything. By the autumn of 1944, Texas began to change color again. The heat lifted, rain returned, and the crops that had barely clung to life began to flourish. Across the Brazos Valley, fields shimmered with green, living proof that even in wartime, life found its way back. Robert Whitaker's farm stood among them. The irrigation system still ran, powered by the same pump, held together by the same crude twist of wire that a German prisoner had fixed months before, neighbors noticed. "You got lucky," one of them said. "Guess that German trick of yours paid off." Whitaker didn't argue. He just nodded and said quietly, "Yeah, guess it did." But inside, he knew it wasn't luck. It was labor, intelligence, and humanity, three things the war had nearly forgotten. Across Texas, hundreds of similar stories unfolded. German POWs worked on ranches, in orchards, and on assembly lines. They built irrigation systems, harvested crops, and repaired broken machinery. Their efficiency was so notable that, by 1945, Texas agricultural production exceeded pre-war levels, despite the manpower shortage. What began as a desperate solution had turned into an unexpected partnership. Farmers who once viewed the prisoners with suspicion began to see them as workers, even craftsmen. For some, respect turned into quiet gratitude. An official U.S. Army report later observed, "The employment of German POW labor not only prevented agricultural loss, but altered public perceptions of the enemy. In many instances, mutual respect replaced hostility." It was an extraordinary phenomenon, invisible to most historians, yet deeply human in its simplicity. Whitaker's own transformation reflected that shift. The man who once spat the word enemy now spoke of the German mechanic with reluctant admiration. The old anger, born from headlines and casualty reports, softened into something closer to understanding. He began to wonder about the man behind the wire, Karl Weber. Who was he before the war? Did he have a family, a farm, a home of his own somewhere across the sea? These thoughts, once unthinkable, now followed him like a quiet echo through the long Texas evenings. One afternoon, Whitaker visited the small army outpost that managed local POW labor. He asked if it was possible to send a message, not a letter of politics, but one of thanks. The officer on duty, surprised but moved, told him it could be arranged through official channels. Whitaker didn't write much. His note was simple. "The man who fixed my pump saved more than my crops. Tell him I won't forget it." It was never clear if the message reached Weber. Wartime correspondence for POWs was slow and uncertain, but for Whitaker, the act of writing it was enough. It closed a circle, eased a conscience, and said what words had refused to say that hot July day. Back inside Camp Hearn, similar exchanges were quietly reshaping men like Weber. The American respect for rules, the fair rations, the humane treatment, the dignity of work, contradicted everything Nazi propaganda had claimed. For many German prisoners, their time in America became a revelation. Years later, some would recall those farms, those small acts of decency, as the beginning of their disillusionment with the regime they once served. Weber himself, according to later Red Cross records, returned to Germany in 1946, one of thousands repatriated after the war's end. His name appeared briefly on a transport manifest, nothing more. Yet, in the archives of a quiet Texas county, the record of POW labor for that summer still listed Weber, Karl, Mechanic, beside the Whitaker Farm's code number. By the end of that year, the war in Europe was shifting toward its final act. The news from across the Atlantic grew darker. Allied troops pushing into France, German cities bombed into rubble, the Reich collapsing from within. In Texas, the POWs read these headlines in silence, sitting beneath the same sun that had scorched their skin and, in strange ways, softened their pride. To the Americans, they were still prisoners. To each other, they had become men again. And on that one farm, as autumn rain fell softly over ripened cotton, Robert Whittaker found himself standing beside the old pump once more. The wire, dull and rusted now, still held. The motor still turned. He brushed his hand over the machine, remembering the heat, the silence, and the man who had changed everything with a simple act of reason. In that sound, the hum of the pump, Whittaker no longer heard a machine. He heard proof that even in the hardest years of war, decency could still endure. The pump had become his reminder, not of loss, but of connection. A monument not made of marble or brass, but of wire. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day. Across the United States, church bells rang, sirens wailed, and strangers hugged in the streets. But on the plains of Texas, the celebrations were quieter. The German POW camps didn't erupt in joy or surrender, only silence. Inside Camp Hearn, the prisoners gathered by the fence lines, listening to the faint sound of distant cheers carried by the wind. For men like Karl Weber, it was the end of a war that had devoured their youth, yet there was no triumph in it, only fatigue and uncertainty. In the months that followed, the U.S. government began the slow process of repatriation. Prisoners were cataloged, medically screened, and shipped east by train, their journeys winding through the same land they had worked for 2 years. Many passed through Whittaker's County on their way to ports in New York or New Orleans. Farmers watched the trains roll by, their boxcars filled with men they once called enemies. Some felt relief. Others felt something they could not name. Whittaker was among the latter. In late 1946, as the last German prisoners departed Texas soil, Whittaker returned to the shed where the old pump still ran. The same patch of wire, blackened and brittle now, remained twisted around the copper lead. He'd never replaced it, despite new supplies being available after the war. It was more than a repair. It was a story. That winter, Whittaker's sons came home from overseas. They returned changed, older, quieter. One of them, Tom, had fought in France. Over dinner, his father told the story of the German who fixed the pump. At first, Tom laughed. "You let a crowd touch your equipment?" His father nodded. "Didn't just touch it, saved it." The laughter faded. The room grew still. In that silence, something passed between them. An unspoken acknowledgement that war wasn't made of monsters and heroes, but of men, all bound by the same fragile wire of circumstance. Meanwhile, in post-war Germany, the country Karl Weber returned to was barely recognizable. The cities lay in ruins, food was scarce, and industry broken. He went back to Stuttgart, where he found his workshop reduced to rubble. His wife had survived, though thin and pale from years of hunger. Weber resumed the work as an engineer, repairing farm equipment for the U.S. occupation forces, just as he had once repaired a Texas farmer's pump. But the years of captivity had changed him. When asked about his time in America, he would often reply, "They treated us better than we treated each other." Friends recalled that he spoke often of a farmer in Texas, a man whose name he could no longer remember, but whose face remained vivid. In a letter found decades later among family papers, he wrote, "I fixed a machine for him. It was nothing, a wire, a circuit. But he looked at me as a man again, not an enemy. That was the moment the war ended for me. In Texas, life returned to its rhythm." The POW camps were dismantled, the fences torn down, the barracks sold for lumber. The land that once housed thousands of German prisoners turned back to fields, leaving no trace of what had been. By the 1950s, few remembered that more than 400,000 German soldiers had once walked this soil, or that their labor had fed the nation through some of its hardest years. Yet for families like the Whittakers, memory lingered quietly. The pump still ran, its faint metallic hum echoing across the fields for decades. When the motor finally broke beyond repair in 1958, Whittaker didn't scrap it. He removed the wire, the same wire Weber had used, and placed it in a small box in his barn. On the lid, written in pencil, he scrawled 4 words: "Fixed by a German, 1944. It remained there long after he was gone. In the end, no monument marked their story, no newspaper headline captured it. But for a brief moment in the summer of 1944, amid war, fear, and heat, 2 men who should have been enemies shared something simple and pure: the will to mend, not destroy. A single piece of wire held more than current that day. It held faith, that even in the darkest chapters of history, humanity can still repair itself, one connection at a time. That wire, in its simplicity, outlived the war, and though rust claimed it, its meaning endures. Sometimes salvation is not won on battlefields, but in the quiet mercy of a helping hand.